Hello. This is part of a series of videos entitled Supernatural Vision of Heavenly Worship. I had this vision 7 years ago in the year 2013. In previous videos, I described how I began worshiping in a very broken, lowly, humble place. And as I worshiped, I had some spiritual beings, some spiritual visitors that came to join me in my worship of the Father and of the Lord Jesus Christ and of the Holy Spirit. And as I was worshiping, and as these spiritual beings joined me, they began lifting up my worship from that lowly, broken place I began. And they encouraged me, and I was lifted up slowly, step by step, to higher and higher levels of glory. And as this progressed, the number of spiritual visitors continued to increase until it became what I'll call a heavenly host. And in my last video, I described how this heavenly host all merged into what I called a tunnel of living worship. And for 2 weeks after that tunnel formed, I could still see that tunnel in the spirit. I could still hear the sound of many waters of that tunnel of worship. And I compare it to Niagara Falls. And just as Niagara Falls never stops, this tunnel of living worship seemed to never stop. It continued to flow past me in the spirit. And when I was before this tunnel and worship, it was like I was before an open heaven. And I could touch things of great glory that were far beyond what I could mentally comprehend. But my spirit was entering into realms of worship that were just glorious, they were infinite, they were far beyond my mental comprehension. Now, over those 2 weeks, I did have some distractions because I had a job, I had to go to work every day. But when I was not distracted by things and I could return to that worship in my heart, as soon as I returned, again, I could see that flow of worship and I could enter into just, my spirit was entering back into just glories. And I was spending a huge amount of time on my knees during this period. I would wake up in the morning, and the first thing I want to do, first thing in the morning, was get on my knees and just re enter into this wonderful worship. And I just stayed on my knees in this glorious worship for hours. But then at some point, I had to go to work. So I would break away, I'd do what I had to do, I'd go to work. But as soon as I got home from work, I was right back on my knees because I just wanted to be in this glory. It's all I wanted to do was be in the glory. So hours every day, I was on my knees in this glory. And one thing that came alive to me were the scriptures. Now, at that time, I didn't know a lot of the Bible at that time. I hadn't memorized a lot of the Bible. But the one part of the Bible that I did know was the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, etc. So I started saying the Lord's Prayer before as part of my worship. And as I said the Lord's Prayer, every word of that prayer seemed to come alive because in this realm of the Spirit in worship, his word became a living word, and every word was like this living, powerful thing. And every word that I spoke of the scriptures of the Lord's Prayer just became alive and real. And Now, since then, that's been happening with more of the scriptures, but that time, the Lord's Prayer. And the big things of that Lord's Prayer that I was entering into was first worship, because the Lord's Prayer talks about worship. It talks a lot about forgiveness. So this forgiveness came into me for everything around me. And spiritual warfare, because the Lord's Prayer talks about spiritual warfare. And at the end of the Lord's Prayer, it talks again about worship. So those four things: worship, forgiveness, spiritual warfare, and back to worship. And that was where I was living for hours and days in that worship. Now I knew that this tunnel of living worship flowing past me, as I described in previous videos, it was made up of a countless number of spiritual beings which were in a state of worship flowing up to our Father in heaven. And I started comparing this flow to a river. It was like a river of worship flowing past me. And after a period of worshiping beside the river, I started to desire to get in the river. And I began doing that at some point. And it was so refreshing to be in that river. It was like another level of glory and praise and refreshing and cleansing and worship and forgiveness and spiritual warfare and more worship. It was another level. And I was just so blessed by being in that river. However, after a time of being in that river, I started realizing that I was not moving farther. It's like if you go out swimming in a river, normally in a river with current, if you get out in that river and you look back at the shoreline, you'll realize that you're moving with the current. But in this case, I would be out in that river, but then I'd look at the shoreline and I'd realize I'm not moving. I'm still at this pretty much the same place I was when I entered the river. And even though I was blessed and refreshed and the glory was beautiful, I wasn't really moving. And then over a little more time, this desire started coming into me to move, to go with the flow. I wanted, it was so glorious, but I knew there was a higher level of glory up that river. I could see parts of it. And all these spiritual beings, they were going there. They were entering into another level that I felt a blockage. I could not go farther. And this was when I started to strive. Now, I use the term striving to enter in. And in some contexts, it's good to strive to enter in. But in other contexts, there's a place where you're striving to enter in goes beyond where you are supposed to go at that time. And in hindsight, I believe I started striving beyond what I was supposed to strive for. And I was trying to enter into things that I was coming up against blockages and barriers. And this discontentment, it's almost like your peace and your joy, the fruits of the Spirit actually start leaving you as you start wanting something that you are not allowed to have. And I compare it to a child who wants to do something that they're not allowed to do yet because they're not mature enough yet. They're not old enough yet. But they see the older brothers and sisters doing things, they see their parents doing things, and they think, I can do that too. I'm old enough. I'm big enough to do it. But the parents will say, no, not yet. Even though you're physically big enough to do it, you're not mature enough and you're not old enough. I'm having limits on you until you grow. But I was like that, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I started doing that in my heart was changing. So as I began to strive to enter in, finding some way to go farther, suddenly I had some more visitors. Now, in that river, there were infinite number of spiritual beings, but I could not see any individual beings in that river because they were all flowing so fast and such a huge number that I could not see individuals. But now I had some more individual visitors. So as I began to strive, suddenly these two spiritual beings, now I don't know if they were angels or part of the cloud of witnesses, they were kind of like a humanoid form. These two spiritual visitors appeared in front of me. And I believe they were in that flow and they departed the flow to come and visit me briefly. And these two beings appeared in front of me. Now, I could not see them clearly. I could not identify them, but I knew that they were looking at me and they were examining me. And I could tell that they could see right into my heart. They could see my attitudes, my motives. They could see into my being and they were examining me. They were assessing me. And and it's almost like I could sense some concern in them. They're like a concerned parent that, this child is not at peace right now. Now, they never spoke to me in words. I don't have a clear message to give you. Oh, they said these words that my soul understood, but they still communicated to me. I believe spirit to spirit, but I still got a message. And the messages I got were first joy. These beings were very, very joyful. And they were very, very thankful, thanksgiving. And they were actually expressing thanks to me because I had had some part, which I described in previous videos, choices I had made and actions I had done had enabled, I use the word enabled, this whole flow of living worship to be established, this open heaven to be opened. This flow was there because of choices I had made. And they were very, very thankful for that. They were joyful and they started encouraging me. Encouragement. And the real message that I got was that I was in a good place, that where I was good, that I did not need to strive to enter in to a higher level at this time. I didn't need to strive. I could see things up that river, but where I was good. So joy, thanks, encouragement, and just you're in a good place. And then I needed to wait, just wait. Maturity will come, but there's a time. It takes time. And I needed to wait patiently. And I compare it earlier, I described a cake being fully baked. And you can smell it when the cake is fully baked, then it's ready to be presented to the Father. But my cake was not fully baked. Now, when I got this message at peace and I was in a good place, I felt something change inside of me. It was like joy and peace again filled my being to where I again came to a good place in myself. And my visitors, now as they were examining me, they could see that. They could tell that I had gotten it, that I had accepted my limitations and my boundaries. Then joy and peace filled me, and they could see that. And when they saw that, their faces, now, even though I couldn't see their faces clearly to identify individuals, I could still see an expression and expressions on both faces. And their faces, which were already joyful, they went to a higher level of, I'll call it exceeding joy. I could tell they were so, their smiles, just like their such joy came on them when I got it. Luke 15:10. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. So, over the 2 weeks after my main testimony, I had several visits just like what I just described to you. One or two beings at a time would visit, and they'd come out of that flow and appear before me, and they would kind of reaffirm and repeat the same message that I got before. Joy, thanks. Each of them were thankful. I think they were all different. I don't think they were the same visitors. I think they were different visitors. But they were, each of them were thankful and joyful, and they encouraged me, and they all told me, I'm in a good place. Just wait. Just wait. Hebrews 12:1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Romans 8:21-23. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. And not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. Hebrews 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Verse 16. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city.